Beyond Round Watches. This is the first ever book written about rectangular watches or angular watches. It's not very thick, it's about 100 pages, but it's packed with information and interesting stories. So we go straight into it. Looking at the index, you can see chapter 1, the origins of timekeeping. We go back to the time when we used the sundial and the water clock. Not many know about the water clock and the pendulum watch clock. Interesting chapter. Then we continue with the origins of wristwatch. We go into the history of wristwatch and we talk about Breguet as the first brand creating a wristwatch. We have a short chapter about square and rectangular shapes. What's the difference between them, and not only the looks, but what's the difference and how we look at it. And in chapter 4 we look at the rectangular aesthetics through time. So we go through different time areas and talk about how rectangular and square watches were used and so on. And then we go into chapter 5, which is a chapter about nature and science, how square and rectangular shapes are used in nature and science. Super interesting, I have to say. And then we go on to talk about the first rectangular wristwatch itself, the history about that. Chapter 7, maybe the most interesting chapter for you guys that would like to look at watches and read about watches. So here we introduce the pioneers of rectangular watches, and as you can see, it's all established historical brands. Chapter 8 is a similar chapter, but we talk about angular watches today. And chapter 9 talk about the challenges there is to design and produce angular watches, and probably a lot of reasons why we don't see a lot of angular watches today lies in this chapter. And then we continue with chapter 10, which is a look into the future of angular watches and why there is a trend on angular watches. And then in the last chapter there, we take a dive into why rectangular and angular watches are beautiful and why they stand out, and why I think every person needs a rectangular watch. Yeah. So let's dive in. We talk about the history of rectangular watches, and here you have Caroline Morat, which was the sister of Napoleon, and she went to Breguet's store and atelier to ask for a timepiece to wear on her wrist. And Breguet rose to the occasion and designed the first ever wristwatch. And this was in the beginning of 1800. Super interesting. And the watch itself does not exist anymore, so we can't look at it, we can't see it. We haven't found it. But the next best thing is this picture. This is a very, very rare picture from the French National Museum of Horology. It's a beautiful picture of the notes from when Breguet wrote about this watch. So this is the first notes about a wristwatch ever done. Super interesting. And we go on and talk about the history and what happened and so on. It's very interesting. Then we jump ahead to the first ever rectangular watch, which of course is the Cartier Santos from beginning of 1900, which was designed by Louis Cartier for his friend Alberto Santos Dumont, who was a aviation pioneer and wanted something practical to measure time when he was up in the air flying his, I don't know if you could call it plane at that time, but still vehicles. Yeah, also a very interesting chapter. And here you have a very, very old sketch about Santos. Okay, continue. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, continue to the chapter about pioneers in rectangular watchmaking, and of course the first company or the brand is Cartier with its Cartier tank, which was developed in the early 1900s. It was a watch that was inspired by the Renault FT-17 tanks from the World War I. This is, of course, as you probably know, a very iconic watch, and you can buy it even today. And then we go on to talk about GL's Reverso, of course. You can't talk about rectangular watches and not mention the Reverso. Designed to be worn during polo games, so you can reverse the dial, you can flip the dial to protect it against hits. Patek Philippe needs to be mentioned. They were a pioneer when it comes to rectangular watches. Here you have the Eiffel Tower with its characteristic ends of the case. You have the banana, probably the opposite of the Eiffel Tower. AP was, of course, a pioneer when it comes to rectangular watches, especially when it comes to the jumping hour watch, which looks super strange but cool, I have to say. You have a little bit about the history about that watch. AP, you maybe didn't knew that AP was a pioneer when it comes to rectangular watches, but they were. And so this is the full calendar rectangular watch. Super interesting as well. Rolex needs to be mentioned. You have to mention Rolex when it comes to rectangular watches. Not many people know, but many of the first watches that Rolex was producing was in fact rectangular. And here you have early Rolex prints, and for me that is obsessed with rectangular watches. I have to say one of the most beautiful collection is Rolex latest Prince collection that was discontinued in 2016. Check that out on internet and you will see 4 absolutely beautiful rectangular watches. Here you have the classical King Midas Rolex Cellini, also nice. And in fact, we need to mention Omega when we talk about rectangular watches. Why is that? Because in my mind, Omega was the first brand creating and producing a dive watch. This is the Omega Marine, which was the first watch ever tested for diving. So they sunk this watch down to 73 meters in 1937, and it was left there for 30 minutes, and it made it. So this is the first dive watch for me. Rolex made the first waterproof watch, a water-resistant watch, but this is the first dive watch for me. Longines was also very, very early when it comes to both watches, rectangular watches, and also movements. They were very early when it comes to movements, rectangular movements. Movements like, the caliber 743 and caliber 847 was very early rectangular movements. Yeah, Gruen is a very iconic watch when it comes to rectangular watches and shapes. Unfortunately, Gruen doesn't exist anymore, but that's how it is. Then we go into angular watches today, and of course we check out the Cartier Santos, a little bit of history and what's special with the Santos. The Tag Monaco, of course, we need to mention that. You have Bell & Ross, their unique design watches inspired by the aircraft instruments. Hermes H, very characteristic. You have the Reverso, the new Reverso. You have sonerwatches, the Amoros, which is a very, very beautiful rectangular watch, and so on. And then we look into the future and why every person should own a rectangular watch. Dare to be different. That's a good, nice statement. So that's it. There you have it. Beyond round watches. Check it out. Order it from sonerwatches.com. sonerwatches.com.